at 11:44 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on Saturday night, Donald Trump posted something on Truth Social that immediately put every energy market, every military command center, and every government across the Middle East on high alert. He wrote in all capital letters, the way he writes when he intends to be taken seriously, that if Iran does not fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from that exact moment, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants. Starting with the biggest one first, 48 hours. Power plants. Starting with the biggest one first. The deadline was set to expire at 7:44 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday. As of this writing, it has either just passed or is about to. Iran's counter-response came within hours. Iran stated through state media that any strike against its fuel and energy infrastructure would trigger retaliatory strikes on all energy and information technology infrastructure and desalination plants belonging to the United States, Israel, in the region. On Monday, Iran escalated further, threatening to attack the electrical plants powering U.S. military bases across the Middle East. Touch our power plants. Every Gulf pipeline burns. 2 statements, 1 deadline, and somewhere between them the most dangerous 48 hours of this entire war. Today we are going to break down exactly what Trump is threatening, what Iran is threatening in return, what happens to 87 million Iranians and to the entire global energy system if either side follows through, and why this specific escalation, more than any missile exchange, more than any naval confrontation, more than anything that has happened in 23 days of war, may be the moment this conflict crosses a line it cannot walk back from. Start with what Trump is actually threatening, because the phrase power plants covers an enormous range of possible targets, and the distinction between them matters enormously. Iran operates approximately 110 natural gas power plants, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. It also runs solar, hydro, wind, oil, diesel, coal, geothermal, and nuclear facilities. The country's electricity grid is sophisticated and deeply interconnected, a product of decades of investment that survived even the worst periods of sanctions and economic pressure. The largest single power generation facility in Iran is almost certainly the Damavand combined cycle power plant, located approximately 70 kilometers southeast of downtown Tehran, with an output of 2,868 megawatts, enough electricity for millions of homes and a substantial portion of Tehran's industrial base. The second largest is the Shahed Salimi plant in Mazandaran province near the Caspian Sea. Third is the Shahed Raji plant, approximately 110 kilometers northeast of Tehran. For context, Florida's West County Energy Center, the largest operating natural gas plant in the United States, produces 3,750 megawatts. Iran's biggest facility is roughly 3/4 of that capacity, serving a country of 87 million people. Trump did not specify which plant he meant as the biggest. He may have been referring to Damavand. He may have been referring to Bushehr, the nuclear power plant on the Persian Gulf coast already struck last week, which at around 1,000 megawatts is not technically the largest, but carries enormous symbolic and radiological weight. His threat was deliberately vague on specifics and precisely clear on intent. Hit and obliterate, starting with the biggest one first. Now here is what that actually means for 87 million Iranians, because this is the dimension of this threat that has received almost no coverage in the past 24 hours. Iran's electricity grid is not a luxury. It is the backbone that keeps a modern society functioning. Hospitals run on it, water treatment plants run on it, sewage systems run on it, food, refrigeration, and supply chains depend on it. Communications networks, including the military communications the IRGC relies on to coordinate its operations, run on it. Destroying Iran's largest power plants does not simply turn off lights. It triggers a cascade. Without electricity, water treatment stops functioning. Without safe water treatment, drinking water becomes unsafe within days across major urban centers. Without electricity, hospitals cannot operate critical care equipment. Without electricity, Food supply chains collapse because refrigeration fails across the entire distribution network. Without electricity, the heating systems millions of Iranians rely on during winter in a country that sees temperatures well below freezing in its northern and central regions stop working entirely. The International Committee of the Red Cross has published detailed analysis of what occurs when electrical infrastructure is destroyed in a densely populated country. They call it the reverberating effects of attacks on electrical infrastructure. Their findings, drawn from Iraq after 1991, Yugoslavia after 1999, Lebanon in 2006, are consistent and alarming. The immediate military benefit of destroying a power plant is limited. The humanitarian toll on the civilian population dependent on that grid is catastrophic and long-lasting. 87 million people. The largest power plants on their grid obliterated. In a country already under a sustained military campaign that has killed thousands and displaced millions, Iran is now entering its 23rd day, isolated from the world, with a regime-imposed internet blackout, now in its fourth week, adding to the wartime distress of millions of civilians who have no independent sources of information. The word obliterate was chosen deliberately. It does not mean damage or degrade or reduce capacity. It means erase from existence. Trump is not threatening to inconvenience Iran's electricity supply. He is threatening to eliminate the infrastructure, keeping the civilian population alive. Iran's response is equally specific, equally deliberate, and deserves the same level of careful analysis. The Iranian military statement named two specific categories of target: energy infrastructure and desalination facilities belonging to the US and its allies in the region. Desalination facilities are not peripheral infrastructure in the Gulf states. They are existential infrastructure. The United Arab Emirates gets approximately 42% of its fresh water from desalination. Saudi Arabia gets approximately 70%. Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, all are critically dependent on desalination for their basic water supply. The Persian Gulf has essentially no natural freshwater resources. Without desalination plants running continuously, these countries cannot sustain their populations. Iran is saying, if you destroy what keeps our people alive, we will destroy what keeps Gulf populations alive. That is not a metaphor. It is a military threat against civilian water infrastructure that directly mirrors the humanitarian logic behind Trump's power plant ultimatum. An energy infrastructure in the Gulf means something very specific. Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq facility, which processes roughly 7% of global daily oil supply, was already on Iran's target list before this war began. The East-West pipeline, the Ras Tanura export terminal, the world's largest crude oil loading facility, the UAE's oil terminals at Fujairah, already struck twice during this conflict, Qatar's remaining LNG infrastructure. Iranian missile strikes have already knocked out Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports. And while Australia could partially fill the gap, it cannot do so alone. Iran is describing, in the most formal military language available to it, a scenario where it systematically destroys the energy export infrastructure of every Gulf state hosting American forces. Not selectively, comprehensively. Now look at the context in which this ultimatum was delivered, because the timing reveals something crucial about what is actually happening inside the Trump administration right now. On Friday, less than 24 hours before the 8-hour ultimatum, Trump said he was considering winding down the war without resolving the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Friday night, winding down. Saturday night, 24 hours later, obliterate the biggest power plant first, 48 hours, or else. Al Jazeera's Washington correspondent noted the contradiction directly. There appeared to be a significant gap between what the White House seems to want from the Strait of Hormuz and what the U.S. military claims to have already accomplished. Analysts noted that Trump had repeatedly called on U.S. allies to help clear the strait with little success, and experts assessed it as unlikely that Tehran would cave to the pressure Trump was seeking to build. That gap between the military saying Iran's ability to threaten shipping has been significantly degraded, and the president threatening to obliterate power plants is not a communications problem. It is a strategic coherence problem. If the military's assessment is correct, then the pressure behind a 48-hour ultimatum is built on capability that may no longer exist in the same form. Opening the strait now might simply reflect that degraded reality rather than compliance with Trump's threat. But if that is true, Trump cannot credibly claim his ultimatum worked. And if he cannot claim it worked, the political logic of escalating to power plants disappears. The timing of this ultimatum, one day after talking about winding down, posted on a Saturday night from Mar-a-Lago, has the feel of a decision made without full coordination with the military command executing this war. Here is the strategic calculation every serious analyst is now running. If Trump follows through and power plants are struck, assuming Iran has not complied, three things happen simultaneously. Iran executes its counter-threat. Gulf energy and desalination infrastructure goes under sustained attack. Saudi Arabia's oil terminals, UAE's water supply, Qatar's remaining LNG capacity, oil prices, which have already soared significantly, with Brent crude climbing above $114 a barrel and U.S. crude above $100, would face a second shock of potentially historic severity. The IEA has already warned that the energy crisis is worse than the oil shocks of the 1970s. Goldman Sachs' worst-case scenario stops being a risk and becomes the baseline, with Goldman Sachs saying Friday that elevated prices could persist through 2027. Under international law, power plants that benefit civilians can be targeted only if the military advantage outweighs the suffering caused to those civilians, a threshold that legal scholars say is highly contestable here. The 1,977 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibit attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Power plants providing electricity for water treatment, hospitals, and heating for 87 million people fall squarely within that category. Every international human rights organization on earth would immediately describe what happened in those terms. The diplomatic isolation America has already experienced, Switzerland blocking weapons exports, NATO refusing to participate, Europe calling the war not theirs, would deepen dramatically. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez urged the opening of the Strait of Hormuz on Sunday, warning the world stood at a global tipping point, where further escalation could trigger a long-term energy crisis for all humanity. And China. China gets roughly 40% of its oil through Hormuz. Asian stock markets plummeted at the start of Monday trading, with Japan's Nikkei sliding 3.5%, South Korea's Kospi down nearly 5%, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng losing 2.7%. A strike on Iranian power plants triggering Iranian strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, sending oil to $150 and threatening the energy security of over 1 billion Chinese people is the scenario most likely fundamentally change Beijing's calculation about remaining on the sideline. But here is the other scenario. If Trump does not follow through, if Monday comes, the deadline expires, Iran has not complied, and the power plants remain standing, then every red line Trump has drawn in this war has now been stated, restated, and either quietly abandoned or retroactively redefined when Iran failed to comply. An ultimatum that expires without consequence is not just a failed threat. It is intelligence. It tells Iran and every watching country exactly how seriously to treat the next one. It tells the Gulf states, whose security depends on American credibility, that the protective umbrella has limits that can be tested and found. Trump has vacillated, repeatedly calling for an international coalition to open the strait, declaring the U.S. would open it unilaterally, and then suggesting it would open itself. He said this war would last 2 weeks. He said Iran was totally defeated. He said prices would drop like a rock. He said winding down. And now, 48 hours, obliterate, starting with the biggest one first. Iranian missiles struck Dimona and Erez late Saturday, wounding around 100 people across the two communities near Israel's main nuclear research center. As airstrikes hit Iran's capital early Monday, the Israeli military said it had begun a wide-scale wave of strikes targeting Iranian infrastructure. Iran also warned Monday that it would deploy mines across the entire Persian Gulf if its coasts or islands come under attack. Saudi Arabia said it intercepted 2 ballistic missiles heading toward Riyadh. The war is not winding down. It is entering its most dangerous phase. The deadline is Monday at 7:44 p.m. Eastern Time. And the world is watching to find out whether the obliteration is real or whether it is the latest in a series of statements that dissolve into the fog of a war that was supposed to be over 3 weeks ago.